The devastating Syrian civil war serves as a clear example of how conflict can result in mass displacement. Similarly, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has caused over 11% of the population to be displaced. This conflict adds to a series of destructive events that have triggered widespread displacement, posing a significant threat to global peace. The latest Global Peace Index reveals several concerning trends. Peacefulness has once again declined, reaching its lowest level in 15 years. The impact of ecological threats is on the rise, and food insecurity is increasing worldwide. Currently, there are 17 countries where at least 5% of the population consists of refugees or internally displaced individuals. This alarming trend has led to a record-breaking number of displaced people globally, with the current figure surpassing 88 million. Given this situation, a delegation representing 7 African countries, that is South Africa, Egypt, Senegal, Congo-Brazzaville, Comoros, Zambia and Uganda, met with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russia's President Vladimir Putin at the end of last week and throughout the weekend. The African contingent proposed a 10-point plan which included acknowledging the sovereignty of Russia and Ukraine and ensuring unimpeded grain exports. On this second half, we look at the impact of the Russia and Ukraine crisis on the African continent, how it has attributed to the refugee crisis, and what the African peace mission has achieved. And joining us to discuss this is Maliba Arnold, is a policy analyst. He joins us all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you very much.
Now, looking at the current conflict, I mean, we have so many going on in Africa. But first of all, let's look at the main issue that was at hand during the weekend, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. From your own observation analysis, what are the main causes and underlying factors contributing to the Russia-Ukraine war? I mean, there's gone for over 2 years, and yet there's been no end to this particular war.
I think the Russian-Ukrainian war is what I would call an echo that has actually probably an afterquake, because we have to put it in the right context, starting from the Second World War, and then having, of course, what at that particular time we had 2 world powers or something close to that. Then, of course, the Cold War, with which then eventually in 1990 we had the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then one by one, a lot of the countries that had allied with Russia have actually been joining NATO. And until 2 years ago, when eventually, I don't think it's even 2 years ago, about 3-4 years ago, when it appeared that now Russia, of course, the former USSR had disintegrated to a point where now a lot of its members are now in NATO. And for a lot of people, especially in the East, it started looking like now NATO is actually storming Moscow. So it's quite a complex issue, but the issues around it still remain the same. You know, I don't want to call it a state-based conflict, but let me talk about states-based. The issues around sovereignty, issues that are rooted in history, issues that have not been solved. But from where we sit today, then you realize that the war in Ukraine, specifically for me, is saying so much about Africa. Like, for example, Ukraine continuously gets bombarded, and of course, there is active war fighting in Ukraine. But have you realized that they're actually sending grain to Africa in the midst of a war? A little bit of the African countries complaining about shortage of grain, but even as the war continues, there have been lots of ships coming from Ukraine to Africa. But then, since the war is ongoing, it also means that the production might not be as much. Again, you realize that then in the following year, we are still going to have that particular shortage, or rather shortage on food. So there's need for probably a very serious conversation. That a country at war can actually export food. And Africa, of course, has got its own challenges with conflicts here and there. But largely today, Africa is relatively peaceful. You are not able to actually compare Africa to Ukraine, for example. But Ukraine is still, interestingly, able to actually export grain. I think we need to call ourselves to a meeting as a continent and as a people, and then ask ourselves hard questions. From Cairo all the way to Cape Town, you wouldn't tell me that it's impossible for us to actually feed ourselves, that it's impossible for us to be able to raise food and grain that can actually feed about 1 billion people. It's unfair and actually very shameful that we as a people are actually depending on somebody who's fighting. So with one hand, the Ukrainians are actually fighting, holding a gun and fighting. And with the other one, they actually are making food for themselves and also for some of us. A little bit, that for me is more disturbing than even what the war means in other spheres. Like, for example, we are talking about the inflation we've seen, the cost of living, everything attended to that. For me, largely, the biggest problem is that somebody at war is one we depend on and look upon. There is a big problem for us as people.
Definitely a lot of questions. I mean, we will look at the broader aspect or the broader prospects of this Russia-Ukraine war. Now, for the purpose of the fact that today is commemorating the World Refugee Day, we talk about conflicts being one of the major reasons why we see a large number of displaced people. We've seen situations in Sudan where people are fleeing conflict. In Ukraine, people are also fleeing conflict. So from your own observation and your own analysis, how has conflict increased this refugee crisis we're witnessing in Africa?
Actually, the refugee crisis, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, is just premised on three things. Number one is conflict, whether it is state-based, whether it's states-based. And then number two, persecution. Number three, of course, is climate. The three things that, for me, drive the refugee crisis. In Africa specifically, then, of course, we have got a problem of conflicts, whether it's between countries. That has actually gone down. But then a lot of those conflicts are within countries, are intra-country, where, for example, the DRC, the infighting in there, of course, there are cases where neighboring countries or communities or forces from outside are actually part and parcel, but it's largely an internal war that has actually then gone out. So conflict is the biggest issue. Then, of course, persecution. So for conflict and persecution, I think that Sharon earlier on spoke about mitigation measures, how we can deal with this particular situation. But I'd like to look at it differently in that before we get into mitigation, there is a saying in Swahili that if you do not seal up a crack, you will actually build a new wall. So way before we get to then building a new wall, what we are trying to do around here, doing mitigation now, are we able to start talking about exactly what can be done to stop us getting there? And for me, issues about fixing governance is a big issue. It's a conversation that when you're talking about refugees, already it's so bad a situation that you don't want to talk, and we are not bold enough to talk about what should have been done or what can we do not to have this particular issue. So deepening democracy as part and parcel of fixing governance would be a very important thing. You know, whether you're going to talk about respecting the rights of refugees, allowing them access, making asylum a human right, embedding that in constitutions, all those are actually easy tools that can actually be embedded within a functional democracy. You know, a lot of times we've seen our people at sea, drowning in seas, people staying out in cold, using very dangerous routes when they could actually have safer routes and corridors through which they can actually escape, whether it's persecution, whether it is conflict. I would want us probably to not be shy about talking about what should have been done to stop this. So we need to build governance institutions. We are talking about Africa in this particular instance. We need to actually strengthen that. We need to actually have an AU that really lives to the billing that it's found in documents. We need to get to a place where we talk to each other boldly. Today, Sudan, like you mentioned, has got a crisis that is ongoing. Everything is actually being blown up. People are being killed. And of course, as expected, scores of refugees are streaming into different countries. And we really get to the core of why we are where we are. What we don't want to say is that there has been a failure of governance. There has been a problem of politics where politics did not work well. We did not fix that in time. The world kept quiet and looked on, probably cheered, whether it's the AU, whether it is the UN, all those other, including neighbors and regional formations. Because what is happening in Sudan didn't begin today. all of us could actually tell that it's going to actually happen. So a lot of times when we want to deal with mitigation, which in and of itself has actually become an industry, the refugees crisis is now an industry. And of course, with a lot of people who have specialized in that, it's all, a lot of people wouldn't exist. There are a lot of other industries that wouldn't exist without this particular crisis. But are we able to stop it? Are we able to forestall it? It is one of those conversations that we should have. Melissa Fleming, who is the spokesperson of UNHCR, which is the UN agency that deals with refugees, says that every refugee wants to go home someday. And with that, every particular person you have met really wants to go home someday. Everybody wants to go home someday. Can we make home be home for people? Because it's easy to talk about home away from home. That is mitigation. But before we get there, are we able to stop that? So it's a conversation that we shouldn't shy away from. Of course, the refugee situation in itself is quite grave. And a lot of times when you start to speak about what would have been, it feels like you're being insensitive. But it's a conversation we need to have, because already, even as we do this particular conversation and even mark this particular day, there are situations where early warning tools can actually point to a soon-to-be refugee situation. We could actually stop that. We could actually probably intervene much earlier. Basic, cheaper tools and approaches could actually save that particular situation. But we will actually wait, sit back, and wait until we get to a place where we have got a situation we can't save and a situation that is too expensive. So probably, for me, the biggest issue is that can we also start talking about how to stop this as opposed to mitigating the impact and what is happening? Of course, so far we know that.
Now, Maliba, I'm going to bring some of the causative issues that you talked about. You talked about the failure of governance. You said before we try and find a solution, let's try and go to the root causes of all of this. You mentioned failure of governance, and during the weekend we saw African governments, even though we have our own issue, forming a peace delegation towards the Russia-Ukraine war. So for you, do you feel that the African government should have intervened in that situation, looking at their non-aligned stand that they've given so far?
Well, like I said, we are dealing with mitigation now. Whether you're going to send in a delegation to go and talk to Russia and Ukraine, you actually know that that is symbolic. It's important, it's good. We should actually allow that. But you and I know that it means little in this particular situation, because Africa has no seat on the UN Security Council. That the whole 52 of us do not have a voice that can actually force the UN to listen to us. Why then do we show up in New York every other time at the end of the year to go and make speeches and then come back home and do agitation like my own president is talking about, we asking for a position on the Security Council? So as much as we are sending in a delegation, it's a good gesture. But you know, none of the African countries, for example, has got weight enough. We are not economically heavy, or rather we are not heavyweights economically, to probably be able to weigh in. There's the weight that actually comes with when it comes to international relations. Sometimes who you are really matters. So we send in a delegation. It's a good gesture. It's symbolic, yes, but we know that it's of little consequence because, first of all, we do not sit in spaces where we can actually impact on this particular situation fully. And a whole continent that is Africa has no seat. We have got an AU that meets continuously. Our people still go to the UN. In New York every time. I've been there several myself, and we just talk about it and go back home. The UN Security Council itself needs reformation. We have not really, for example, been serious about that particular issue. If on one occasion, all of the members of AU boycotted going to the UN, we will get that particular position. But because our government officials want to go to the UN, do shopping, get per diems and allowances, this is something that we are not able to agree on. Basic small things. These things don't need bloodshed. And then with a position on the UN Security Council, for example, when you send a delegation to Russia, you have got some weight. Your words are a little bit heavy, and you can be listened to. So we are doing that. But what have we done at home? So even as we try to reach out on that particular end, this is just a man who's going to reach out to a richer neighbor and tell him, please don't fight because we will die of hunger. We are here, depending on Russia and Ukraine to send us grain. Even as most of Africa is relatively peaceful, we are appealing to two neighbors who are fighting because we depend on them. As in, there's too much shame on us, even as we do that. Meanwhile, we have got our own home, let me call them home ground battles that are going on. Somalia has not been where it's going to 30 years, and we've done not so much. We do not, every time you see the boots on the ground marching in any of those conflict areas, African boots that is, you will realize that a lot of that money is foreign money, not our own money. So even as we try to put boots on the ground, whether it is in DRC, whether it is in Somalia, whether it is now in Mozambique, somebody else is footing that bill. So are we serious about peacekeeping? Are we even serious about the refugee issue? I don't want to talk about the mitigation. Sharon already did that. We will talk about governments, of course, turning the refugees, politicizing the issue, where you're going to blame refugees for all the problems, the failures of regimes and everything else. But I would want us to, I want to actually probably pitch my particular conversation today and execute my contribution today from this particular perspective. Can we talk about preventive measures as opposed to mitigation? It's okay, the mitigation, there's a situation already, we can deal with that. But I want us to actually start thinking about, can we stop this? Yes, we can. There's nothing that is difficult.
Yes, I understand what you're talking about of preventive measures, but at the same time, we're dealing with an issue at hand. So when there's already a problem, we have to look for a solution. So yes, we understand we have to go to the root causes, but when there's a problem at hand, what are the solutions that we have to bring in place to solve these problems? Now, earlier on, you talked about the issues of the UN Security Council and Africa not having the position there. But at the same time, we see a situation where European countries are looking for the position of African countries. We saw Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that Africa should not rally around the neutral stand, but should rather condemn Moscow's invasion of Ukraine because it sends a signal to the whole world against the aggressors, which is Moscow. So do you also feel that Africa, I mean, seeing that they have intervened in this particular situation, seeing that they have formed the peace delegation, should they still hold on to their neutral stance when it comes to the Russia-African war and when it also looks at the situation of aggressors in a conflict?
I think the quote-unquote neutral position held by African countries is, for me, a joke. It's actually a stupid joke because a lot of the material that is actually doing war fighting in that particular area comes from Africa. It's a lot of our minerals that actually then make the weapons that are going to that particular end. Africans are still, they're not neutral because they're buying weapons, of course, from Russia, others partly buy from Ukraine. So no one in this particular instance is 100% neutral. When we talk about neutrality in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, again, we're also being dishonest as a people. Because every time you choose neutrality, when there is an aggression, when there is something wrong happening, you have already chosen to side with the aggressor. So in this particular instance, when Africa talks about being neutral, they honestly are siding with Russia. They are buying Russian weapons, they are buying Russian jets. You saw the Russian foreign ambassador going around, including coming to Nairobi. What are they going around doing? They're not necessarily just going around saying, passing greetings and probably asking for support. What kind of support? Of course, you buy their weapon, they will have the money to then sustain the war. So in this particular instance, practically, of course, de jure, Africa is neutral. De facto, Africa is actually supporting Russia because they are buying their weapons. They are supplying them, and quiet as it were. Africans are so loud when it comes to sovereignty, especially when it's about some other people, especially outside of the continent. We talk about sovereignty. We are so big on talking about sovereignty of nations and everything else. Here, a country invades another country, and we don't want to be bold enough to talk about it. So, whereas de jure, Africa is actually neutral, de facto, Africa is supporting the aggressor, which is Russia. That is my opinion.
Okay. Now, going back to the issues that you raised, talking about how we can deal with the main issues, that the root causes of this conflict that we're seeing, how do you think we can have good governments, or how we can have more checks and balances for government in a way that we do not have these issues, prolong or become bigger conflict or global issues that we've been witnessing?
There's the concept of an open future, whether we talk about open societies, open government, open development, whatever we are doing, even open technology. The world increasingly, and of course we've had this for the last 20 years, the world has actually reduced and it's now a global village. As you do that, you realize that we in Africa, for example, are so far divided. We are on the same continent, but we have got so much wages between us because you're going to find the wages of race, there is a wage of ethnicity generally, and then of course radical nationalism that is around. The walls of nationalism need to fall. if we are going to strengthen, because part and parcel why we actually have got a lot of these governance problems is this thing called nationalism, a sovereignty that was actually imposed on us, and now we define ourselves differently. And with that, the consequences have been that something could be happening across the border. For people who speak the same language, they share the same history, the geography has got annexes, but you do nothing about it because that is a different country. So you ask exactly how we are able to sort this and move forward. I think that simply pushing through the ideals of democracy, ideals of an open society. Of course, there are others that probably Africans might not feel very comfortable with, but generally an open society, an open-facing society in and of itself really enhances democracy. When we talk about deepening democracy, it should not just be about regular elections, because the dictators of old have now learned how to win elections. They can win all the elections you want. So just regular elections shouldn't be enough. So are we auditing what we call democracy today? Are we looking at our governance and probably benchmarking, looking at best practices, making it evolve to serve our interests? But over and above, we need to start talking about integration. It's something that we shouldn't also wait and allow our children probably, or the children of our children, to start thinking about it when it's become more than necessary to actually do that. So the regional blocks need to integrate. A lot of these countries we have, some of them are not even economically viable. They can't run as a country. That is why we are dependent on other people. The West of Africa, look at the whole of the US, functioning as a federal republic, doing quite very well, because numbers count for something. Numbers matter. And the numbers that are in Africa are numbers that should matter. In fact, they matter. But a billion of us in small fiefdoms we call nations, some of those countries, you can actually cross them with 1 hour when you're driving on land, not flying. So we need to start talking about integration, because when we start talking about integration and enhancing that, there's a little bit of accountability beyond the institutions that are in countries, home countries. So, for example, in EAC, if integration is strengthened to a level where the East African community is a little bit powerful, they can hold Uganda to account, they can hold Kenya to account, South Sudan to account on whatever is happening.
I mean, Maliba, we could go on and on. You talk about integration, accountability. There's a whole lot of lessons to be learned from all this conflict we're witnesses and how we can solve the root causes. But unfortunately, we'll have to draw the conversation to a close here. We'll definitely subsequently have more conversations like this. But thank you so much, Maliba Arnold, for sharing so much thoughts on this discussion. And we do hope that this World Refugee Day brings a whole lot of limelight to the issues affecting Africa and ways we can have good governance. Thank you so much for joining us on Onslaught.
Thank you very much.